And Niyamgiri now continues to play the role it has as the sacred mountain of the local tribe, but as the source of water, because bauxite holds water. This is a source of 32 springs, 3 rivers. Entire rivers are having to be rerouted in order to be able to produce aluminium, because 1 ton of aluminium uses 1,200 tons of water. I mean, if people knew what it takes to make aluminium, we would be minimizing its use. And instead, of course, what does the industry want? It wants the Indian use of aluminium to go up from 1 kilogram per capita, which is, 1 kilogram per capita divided by 1.2 billion is actually a small number using aluminium, because the poor in the villages, they have their leaf plates. They want it to go up to 50 kilograms per capita. Multiply that by 1.2 billion. And increasingly, our minds are shut off from the full consequences of the production and consumption system. Violent economies are then generating other levels of violence. They're generating violence against human rights. And of course, every time, the human rights activist in China who just got the award, and then there's this caricature saying, oh, the West stands for human rights. And I keep saying, Monsanto's rights over life on earth being pushed through the WTO, the 200,000 farmers in India who've committed suicide because of the debt linked to the high costs of Monsanto seeds. Is that defense of human rights? Because you make human rights a tiny little box. You take away the right to food, you take away the right to water, you take away the right to a livelihood. And you shrink human rights so tiny that then you can consistently appropriate them. I was reading yesterday's USA Today, and it had a cover story on the current feeling in the United States. And it talked about how 6 in 10 Americans are very worried about big government. And there was a phrase after that which said that the reason people are worried, the federal government poses an immediate threat to the rights and freedoms of ordinary citizens. And it's true, but it does it on behalf of giant corporations. And the corporate part of the equation is somehow not seen by the Tea Party, even though the movement began when the banks failed. It began as an anger against the bailouts. And somehow, the corporations are the saviors, and government has become a problem, rather than saying the government's become a problem because it's not doing its job of regulating the excesses of big banks and big corporations. I call it the inverted state. The state is supposed to protect citizens from the power of big money. That's how the bourgeois state rose. It has now become an instrument to shrink the space of freedom of ordinary people in order to expand the markets for corporations. But expanding the market means turning everything into a commodity. Food has become a commodity, and since food became a commodity, what do we have? Hunger on a scale this world has never known. Food deprivation was always local. You had a famine, then the rains came, you grew your food. You had a war, the war passed, grew your food. It was always localized in space and time. Hunger today is structural and permanent. 1 billion people are hungry. And it's structural because you're pushing a system of food production that came out of the war and is getting farmers into debt. Everywhere in the world, small farmers are losing out. The foreclosures in this country has wiped out family farms. In countries like India, it's so sudden that farmers are committing suicide. And those who aren't committing suicide and are still in debt are having to sell everything they grow in order to pay back the debt for the chemicals in the seeds. And that's why of the 1 billion people hungry, 500 million are growers of food. And that figure alone is enough reason to recognize that something is extremely wrong with our current economy and our current food system. But when food is turned into a commodity, it doesn't really matter anymore what it's used for. So 70% of the grain in the US is fed to animals. And it's not that the animals are gaining, because they don't want to eat grain, they're herbivores. They want grass in their 4 stomachs, not genetically modified soya diets or genetically modified corn diets. And besides torturing the animals, it's leading to huge contributions of greenhouse gases. Methane from factory farms is a major contributor. And now, of course, just at the time when we should have recognized that the combination of climate change and peak oil should make us move into a post-oil economy, into renewable economies of a seriously renewable kind. You've got the oil economy eating into the food economy to create biofuels. So in 2008, when the prices of food rose very rapidly, President Bush, of course, accused India for the price rise. I did a very quick calculation and showed that 12% increase in cereal consumption had taken place in the US, 2% in India. Now the 12% increase had not been for people. The 12% increase had been for biofuel, for cars. And 330 million people could be fed with the grain annually that's going into running cars now. Ethanol from corn and diesel from soya. And the figures are enough to tell us this is the wrong way to go. In 2006, 20% of the corn of this country was being used to make ethanol and replacing only 1% of the oil. If it had jumped to 100% of the corn, it would only have replaced 7%. So you'd have to then invade into other people's lands in order to get the remaining 93%, which is why we now have land wars on a scale that's unimaginable. Millions and millions of acres of Africa being grabbed for biofuel. To replace all the oil of this country, you need 1.4 million square miles of corn or 8.8 million square miles of soya. This is the path of what I have called eco-imperialism. As past greeds creates a resource and pollution crisis, instead of stepping back and saying, we will conserve our resources, we will use, yes, those with power say, let's grab what remains. And if we have to unleash wars for that, we'll do it. So you have oil wars. I mean, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are oil wars. You have water wars. Darfur, which is defined as a religious war, is actually a war over water in a shrinking Lake Chad. And it's a combination of climate change that has destroyed it, as well as bad land use. The most invisible war, but in my view, the one that will have the longest consequences, are the biodiversity and seed wars. Because if we continue to lose species at the rate at which we are losing them, if the monopolies that are growing continue to grow at the pace at which they are growing, we could in 5 years' time be in a situation where there's no seed to plant. Already the GM crops are starting to fail.